Happy New Year and welcome to the launch of Season 3 of Creative Solutions for a New World, Climate and Artist Series. I'm Frances Littman, your host. I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this region and First Nations worldwide. For thousands of years, the abundance that these lands and waters provide us to live, work, and play is due to the reciprocal relationships by which Coast Salish and the world's first people have lived and live today. Well, we have an incredibly full program today, and we will endeavor to answer all your questions live before the conclusion of today's show. If we run out of time, we will get answers to your questions and post them with the video replay early next week. So please feel free to use the Q&A button found at the bottom of your screen. Introducing our first guest of today will be Jonathan O'Riordan. Jonathan is a former Deputy Minister of the Environment and our community partner. John keeps the legacy of his late wife, Gail O'Riordan, a beloved music teacher and professional cellist, alive through this Climate and Artist webinar series. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Frances. So the title for this new season is called Charting the Road to Carbon Neutrality. This is a particular poignant title to me, as carbon neutrality lies at the heart of Gail's legacy. She was always optimistic that humanity would obtain carbon neutrality in the lifetime of our son, Kevin, so within the next 20 or 30 years. But this will require a universal change in consciousness, which will make reducing carbon and regenerating biodiversity a badge of honor for every living human being over the next 30 years. So I'd like to walk you through how we're going to follow this journey over this upcoming series of webinars. The total menu is not all-encompassing, but it does cover some of the key actions we need to get to carbon neutrality. So the first slide shows you some of the webinars that are coming up over the next 9 sessions. So next week, we're going to talk about the shift to sustainable communities and how we can reduce material wastes. I will talk a bit about that at the end of the show. And then we're covering a couple of webinars on dealing with sustainable forests, agriculture and soils. And Kathy Code will be joining us in the next half hour to talk about, to preview some of the work she's doing on regenerating forest values in British Columbia. Then we have a seminar on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, because we collectively cannot find carbon neutrality in Canada without true reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples across Canada. So that's an important component of the journey. We'll be talking about some of the feedback loops in more detail that Bob Sandford will be canvassing in the next 10 minutes, particularly related to the Arctic of Canada. And then we'll be looking at how we conserve water, because water is going to become a key resource globally and in Canada as we face an increasing emergency over the coming decades. Grace will be talking later about engaging youth and what role they want to see us play and they play in striving for carbon neutrality. And then at the end, we'll be looking at how we engage communities, and so how communities are taking up the challenge of saving a ton in 21. How do we collectively save a ton of carbon in our individual footprints in 21? And we'll be helping you to work through how you can save a ton as you follow our webinar series. And of course, we'll be engaging in the arts throughout, and we have a special program on February the 10th where we talk about how the arts can contribute to this journey. Now, just before I introduce Bob, I do want to talk about some of the things that are good and bad and unfortunately ugly as we start this decade. So Mace will be talking about the role of the US under the Biden administration. It seems to be that in 2020, the US actually met its initial Paris Agreement target of a 21% reduction in carbon from 2005, mainly through transfer of coal power generation to natural gas power generation. But on top of that, we've seen trillions of dollars now shift towards renewables, and institutional investors like pension funds and teachers funds are beginning to place money seriously into non-fossil fuels investments over the globe. Car makers are beginning to shift significantly to electric vehicles. And most importantly, we'll be talking at the end of the seminar series that the International Energy Agency will be charting about how it sees we can reach a carbon neutral future in energy by 2050. And that report is due in May, so we'll be touching base on that. But on the ugly side, we've seen that 2020 was the warmest year, tied with 2016, ever in the history of humanity. Secondly, that warming in the Arctic is much, much greater than it is across the globe. Across the globe, it's about 1 degree Celsius. In the Arctic, it's up to 6 degrees Celsius. And this is significant impacts, as Bob will attest in a few minutes. And wildfires around the globe are emitted in 2020 over 244 billion tons of carbon. So put that in perspective, Canada emits less than 1 billion tons of carbon. So that's a huge amount of carbon that's coming from the forest fires. And the costs of extreme weather events, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, etc., are now exceeding 200 million globally. And that amount is going to increase as we carry through the decade. And carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are now 50% higher than they were before the Industrial Revolution. So with all of that, I want to introduce Bob Sandford to talk about what are the implications of some of these major warming events in the climate. And Bob, as you know, is the chair of the Climate Security United Nations University in Water, Environment and Health, and a great friend of climate and the arts. So Bob, you've heard some of these stories about the Arctic and the Arctic warming and feedback loops. What are the potential for these feedback loops to swamp the natural sources of carbon reduction that we are making in the coming decades? In other words, are we in trouble that we can't catch up with what's going to be happening out of the Arctic?
Well, certainly, John. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. There is potential for feedback loops to release from natural systems that will really complicate our efforts to find carbon neutrality. And we will go into considerable detail on this in our webinar on permafrost on April 21st. But as you already indicated, and as Mace Rosenstein will point out in the next presentation in detail, there were drastic drops in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse emissions in 2020. And this, of course, was a direct consequence of the unfortunate, painful, and completely unplanned economic slowdown and other costs associated with coronavirus-induced lockdowns around the world. What happened in 2020 demonstrates that the emissions reductions the world needs are achievable, but they have to be undertaken on purpose and purposefully, not haphazardly under mortal duress, so the poorest aren't those who suffer the most and pay the greatest relative costs. But even if the painful reductions we achieved in 2020 are in fact sustained once the pandemic is managed, they are still not enough. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere continue to rise despite our unplanned and abrupt reductions in carbon emissions, which suggests that feedbacks have been initiated that will result in increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere unless we're able to get ahead of rising global temperatures now. And as you know, feedback loops occur whenever warming causes more warming, and when warming begins to be self-perpetuating. And these effects can be, as we are concerned about, irreversible. And one such feedback has been identified right here in Canada, and that's the greenhouse release feedback caused by permafrost thaw. And there's 3 times more carbon sequestered in permafrost than in all the forests on Earth. And unchecked, a warming Arctic could release the same amount of greenhouse gases as are currently being emitted by the entire United States each year. So what I'm saying here is the Arctic has gone from a carbon sink to being a carbon source. And once the feedback like that gets going, it will be very, very difficult to stop. And it's not just what is happening on land in the Arctic that should concern us. In the Canadian Arctic, everything related to climate change is going wrong, it seems, all at once. It appears that less and thinner ice affects cloud formation, and more clouds in the sky trap heat, which leads to warmer temperatures. And as the atmosphere continues to warm, The types of clouds that are forming are precisely those that capture heat and result in warmer temperatures. And this appears to be another positive feedback, another way in which climate change drives itself forward. So the concern here is that if permafrost thaw continues to occur at even current rates, the national goals for carbon emissions reductions will continue to be moving targets. Because of permafrost thaw and other feedback releases, Canada's stated goal of exceeding our 2030 emissions reductions target and net zero carbon emission by 2050 will recede continually beyond our grasp. So stated bluntly, we are at a very important moment, and perhaps past that moment, the climate tipping point, beyond which the option of carbon neutrality may no longer be easily available to Canadians.
Thanks, Bob. That doesn't sound too optimistic, but let's be positive here. What else can we do in order to counteract this feedback loop? What else can we do in terms of reducing our carbon footprint?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is to understand that we cannot allow it to be too late. And what's happening in terms of climate feedbacks doesn't have to be the end of the situation here. Well, it's true that in warming the Arctic, cutting down our forests and damaging our planet's soils, we are releasing carbon dioxide, but the converse is also true. The living Earth can be our ally and our partner in reversing the damage we've done to our only home. By renewing nature's processes for sequestering carbon, we can store carbon in life. And Indigenous people have known these things for some time. So instead of proposing that we madly pump dangerous sulfur compounds into the upper atmosphere or install mirrors in space, this is the geoengineering we need. We need bio-geoengineering, not more mechanical geoengineering. So to refreeze the Arctic, we need to reduce our emissions of heat-trapping gases. But just reducing emissions will not be enough. If we take care of nature, if we restore nature, nature will take care of us. We cannot halt permafrost thaw directly, but we may be able to do it by restoring forests, restoring soil health, and rewilding our world. And in the end, oddly enough, saving the Amazon could save our Arctic. Our individual futures now depend on the behavior of all of us and also on planetary health. We have no choice but to recognize that we're all in this together. And I look very much forward to that webinar.
Well, Bob, actually, we're going to be bringing Kathy Court on if we're able to. She's actually having a bit of a power outage right now, but she is an expert in how we can use increased biodiversity to capture carbon in forests and our soils. And she'll be very positive in bringing new ideas and new energy to this solution that you've outlined. So let's talk about water, because that's another webinar that's coming up later in the season, and that's such a critical resource. We're already in a water emergency in Canada, so what concrete actions can Canada take to deal with this emergency going forward?
Well, Dr. John Pomeroy, who's the director of the Global Water Futures Research Program, the largest university-led water and water-related climate research initiative in the world, will be discussing exactly these matters on a webinar on mitigating the global water crisis in May. And some of the actions, concrete actions he will be recommending will include creating and mobilizing the knowledge needed to predict and respond to water problems. That's both scientific and Indigenous wisdom. Strengthening transboundary water management and cooperative federalism. Strengthening reconciliation with Indigenous people and improving collaborative river basin planning. So when you hear Dr. Pomeroy, you'll know that we don't want for solutions. We need to act on the solutions. It will be a terrific webinar.
So Bob, we've gone through, or we're currently going through, the most major pandemic for a century. But I think we're learning some positive lessons from that in terms of collaboration, quick response from government, a universal approach to finding a vaccination. Surely some of these responses give you some hope that even in a climate crisis, we can band together as humanity and deal with this over the next 30 years. What are your thoughts on what we can learn from our pandemic response?
Well, first of all, I have a lot of hope, and this has been a very interesting experience. COVID is bad, And it's going to get worse, at least until enough are vaccinated. And in the meantime, climate change and its symptoms are going to get worse, as you've already indicated. COVID has, however, shown us that nations can pull together in the face of a global emergency. And it's not always pretty. And there are so many divisions in the human outlook on rights and responsibilities, and as such, vast inequalities. But pulled together, we can, and we've seen that. So there's an interim vaccine for climate change too, but for it to work, we all have to take it. And there are a lot of anti-vaxxers who don't want it and many who won't take it. But the fact is that while achieving the goals of the Paris Accord would certainly give humanity some breathing room, there is no escaping that the warming will be ongoing. We already know that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will have serious consequences. We know, for example, that even if the world stopped emitting carbon dioxide tomorrow morning, the amount presently in the atmosphere remains poised to generate 100-fold increase in the frequency of floods along many of the world's coastlines by mid-century. So it's also clear that no amount of adaptation will be enough if emissions reductions remain unconstrained, because that would lead to warming that would go far beyond what humanity has experienced. Conversely, it's also true that no degree of emissions reductions will be enough to spare communities that don't adapt. So the bottom line is that it seems from a UN point of view that few, if any, countries are sufficiently prepared yet to deal with what's coming. A yawning gap has opened up between what countries know about the risks of climate change and what they're prepared to do to reduce them. In a riskier new era of climate change, the longer countries take to close that gap, the more painful and deadly the outcomes. And on the other hand, though, we have learned from this emergency that simple idealism, the kind of hope you're talking about in this webinar, can still prevail. If people cooperate, they will achieve better outcomes and more durable solutions than they can on their own. And as Fareed Zakaria noted in his book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, it is not irrational optimism to believe that cooperation can change or even save the world. It is simply common sense. So in closing, this pandemic has created the possibility for massive change and reform. It's opened up a path to a new world, and it's up to us to seize this transformational moment. Nothing is written, but the opportunity is here for us to take that moment and change the world.
Thank you, Bob. Your answers are pertinent as always. So there's two big events in 2021 which are going to have a major influence on this carbon neutrality. One is the Biodiversity Convention by the UN in the spring of 2021, which will look at how ways in which we can conserve our biodiversity and regenerate its values. And the second, of course, is the relook at the Paris Accord in November 2021 in Glasgow, where all the countries have to dust off their carbon reduction strategies and hopefully step up to the mark. So one of the big players here will be the US, and under a new administration, it promises to bring much more excitement and engagement than clearly was the situation under Trump. So Bob, I'm going to let you introduce our close friend, Mace Rosenstein, to talk about what he sees as the future under a Biden administration, dealing with the transition and climate action.
Great to see you again, Mace, and thank you very much for coming back and being on this webinar. Mace, given that you've spoken to us before and have very close knowledge and understanding of what's happening in the United States, may I ask, we Canadians are finding it difficult to assimilate what's happening in the United States since you last spoke about this on November 25th. We want to spend a few minutes discussing the prognosis for President-elect Biden's climate program, but I wondered first if you might be able to reflect on recent events and tell us what you think about what's happening.
Hello, Bob and friends. I'm just thinking about, I don't know if you remember, Bob, when Robin Williams once said that Canada is like a really nice apartment over a meth lab. I was thinking about that the other day because I would submit that the meth lab has exploded and the fire is raging. And not only that, the downstairs neighbors are just sitting around getting high while the fire department is roasting marshmallows. After 4 years, Bob, of lies, of clownish ineptitude, after the transformation of the US government into what resembles a family-run crime syndicate, and the Republican Party into something, I don't know, out of Weimar Germany. And after a resounding display of revulsion by more than 81 million American voters in November, we seem to have reached the apotheosis of Trump's reign of terror. And now it's actual terror, domestic terrorism in Washington, D.C. and across the land. As you note, much has happened and much can yet happen before Biden is inaugurated on Wednesday. In fact, it's happening as we speak in the US Congress right now. And I'm hopeful we'll have an opportunity to try to make sense of these events in future conversations. So today, I don't want to talk about the faux revolutionaries who brought their libertarian grievance to the Capitol on January 6th, or to talk about that there were maple leaf waving Canadians among them. I don't want to talk about the crypto-fascist police officers who opened the doors for the rebels and then posed for selfies with them. I don't want to talk about the unlawful and possibly seditious conduct of the President of the United States and his Republican enablers in both the Senate and the House. I don't want to talk about the sight of now 20,000 troops taking up positions on the streets of Washington, D.C. in order to ensure the continuity of the US government next week. I don't want to talk about Joe Biden saying, well, this is not who we are. Because of course, it's exactly who we are. We just don't want to see it. So no, Bob, I'm not going to talk about those things. Today, I want to talk about Abraham Lincoln, who on December 1st, 1862, a year and a half into the American Civil War, said this: "We cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We hold the power and bear the responsibility. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." So Trump and the Republicans have sown the wind, and now they, and unfortunately we, it seems, are reaping the whirlwind. They'll be remembered in spite of themselves. So that's my sermon for today, Bob. It's been a long 2 months. I fear the next week may be even longer.
Well, I think it's really important that you're telling us about this now and to express such strong feelings about it, because this next week is going to be very, very, very difficult for many people. Clearly, we will be watching events and trying to remain hopeful that the union will endure for another 7 days and that Joe Biden will can begin the urgent and difficult work of healing the nation. In the meantime, let's turn to one of the other existential crises facing the new Biden administration. We have spent time in earlier webinars discussing Biden's climate agenda and the extent to which he intends to embed climate action in many aspects of domestic and foreign policy. Might we spend a few minutes discussing the legal tools that Biden might use to implement his climate agenda and the obstacles he might confront as he does so?
Sure, and happily we can start with some good news. As you know, an economic analysis published yesterday indicates that US greenhouse gas emissions fell more than 10% in 2020, reaching their lowest levels in about 3 decades. As John mentioned, that decline actually might enable the US to meet its emissions reduction targets under the Paris Agreement. Now, also, as John said, most of the reductions were due to decreased economic activity caused by an unchecked pandemic. Parenthetically, I guess we could note that Trump could therefore take credit for them. But they do suggest that behavioral and operational changes can have an immediate positive impact. And I think they point a way forward for policymakers to take stronger action on climate in this transformational moment. Just a few of the report's key findings. Last year, electricity sector emissions in the States fell by more than 10% as the trend away from coal accelerated. The US produced roughly as much electricity last year from renewable sources as it did from coal. Transportation, meanwhile, saw a 15% decline in emissions in 2020. People simply stopped driving and flying. And emissions, even from heavy industry and manufacturing, dropped about 7%. In other good news, Biden has pledged to rejoin the Paris Agreement, as you know, and he can do that literally with the stroke of a pen. Under the terms of the accord, he can bring the US back to the table simply by providing 30 days written advance notice of his intent to do so. No Senate approval is required in the States, and Biden has said that he intends to send that letter on Wednesday afternoon.
This gives us hope. Now, there was some good news in the coronavirus relief package, was there not, related to climate? As unexpected as that may have been, can you tell us about that?
Sure, that's right. Happily, Congress has already done some of Biden's work for him. The nearly $1 trillion relief package passed just before Christmas included several climate-related provisions passed happily on a bipartisan basis. Here are just some of its key features. The law mandates reductions in the use of hydrofluorocarbons by 85% over the next 15 years. It authorizes tax credits and funds new research and development programs for solar and wind generation and energy storage. It includes a non-binding, but in my view, very significant sense of Congress resolution directing the Energy Department to prioritize funding for research to achieve what the legislation called 100% clean, renewable, or zero emission sources for the country's power generation.
What about undoing the willful, regressive climate measures of the Trump administration? How challenging will it be for Biden to undo the damage Trump has done?
That's a very good question. And I would say, Bob, that Biden's options are spread along a continuum of difficulty. Just to set the table, as we've discussed previously, Trump rescinded, repealed, or weakened about 100 environmental regulations. And I have to say, just to digress for a minute, even on their way out the door, these guys continued to trash the environment. Yesterday, Trump administration officials posted a series of reports purporting to represent the current state of the science within the administration on climate change. The papers include claims that climate change is natural, that the sun and not human-caused pollution is responsible for it, and that its effects will be minimal if there are any at all. And I also just can't resist adding that one of the featured authors of these reports has, in his other work, likened climate scientists' focus on carbon dioxide to the demonization of the Jews under Hitler. Anyway, back to our topic. Whether out of laziness or realpolitik in trashing the climate, Trump relied extensively on executive orders rather than seeking legislation or rulemakings. And happily, many of these destructive Trump initiatives can be undone pretty easily. Presidents can issue or rescind as many executive orders as they like, including rescinding those of their predecessors. So on his first day, Biden could issue new executive orders that would effectively revoke some or all of Trump's. And in fact, what you see there, the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia has already drafted a model executive order that could be used by the new administration to rescind a number of Trump orders while setting out new policy initiatives and directing federal agencies to implement them. So an order like this could address, say, Trump policies relating to things like the Keystone Pipeline, vehicle emissions, methane emissions, and air toxins and mercury emissions from new power plants. There's another category that's relatively easy. The administration could stop or reverse Trump environmental rollbacks that are still in the midst of the rulemaking process, initiatives that haven't yet resulted in the actual adoption of new regulations. So for example, Trump's EPA has launched a proceeding to loosen rules governing emissions by coal-fired power plants. A Biden EPA could simply terminate that proceeding so that the current stricter emission standards would remain in place. Biden has a similar path to undo environmental rollbacks that may have taken effect but are subject to challenge in the courts. For example, California has appealed Trump's revocation of its ability to set stricter pollution standards for cars. Biden could tell the Justice Department to drop the case and start the process of reinstating the California policy. But there's another more difficult category. It's going to be harder, Bob, for Biden to change Trump rules that have become final and are no longer subject to judicial review. For some examples, Trump's proposals affecting methane emissions, carbon dioxide pollution, and protected waters have all become final rules. Although under an arcane statute, the Congressional Review Act, a Democratic Congress theoretically can overrule some of those rules, generally speaking, they can't be replaced or even modified without going through a new formal rulemaking process, which is governed by federal statute, the Administrative Procedure Act, and can take 18 to 24 months or even longer. And I would also note, even if administrative agencies move quickly to implement the Biden agenda and the initiatives he has laid out, judicial appeals of new Biden-issued rules will inevitably occur. They will inevitably go to the Supreme Court, and that could be rocky because that court, as we know, is no friend of the environment. So obviously we'll be monitoring and following developments, hope to have a chance to update the group as events unfold and if we get past next Wednesday.
But we're lucky, Mace, to have you as part of this webinar series, and we hope you'll be back on a regular basis throughout this series. Thank you for your most informative presentation.
Thanks.
It was fantastic, Mason. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, John. So Kathy Code is one of our incredible collaborators, presenters, and she's a co-partner actually in this webinar series. And she's up in the Yellow Point area, and I gather there's some power outages. So we're not 100% certain if we're going to be able to get Kathy on the program now, but we're going to try. So she could come in any moment. John, though, would you like to say a few words about her presentation so that if she does come in, we can just let her take over?
Sure, Francis. What Kathy is going to talk about is, and she's got a seminar later on in our series about the importance of regenerating biodiversity. She's a wonderful proponent of the new forest management regime where we plan in nature's values, not in man's and industrial values. And she is a proponent of the work done by the Wildwood Forest to demonstrate how a forest based on biodiversity principles can also be an economic forest and create jobs and create value. But it's very important, I think, that we look at the soils, look at agriculture, look at forests to see how we can turn them around from being carbon sources to carbon sinks, so that we can pull up to 10 billion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere over the next 30 years by creating new forests, managing forests better. And one of the points that Kathy would be making is in BC here, we have to put a moratorium on cutting old growth forest because old growth forest is our key carbon resource. And as we cut down that forest, we emit carbon. So we've got to control what's going on in our old growth forest, replant what's available and make sure that our forests not only create jobs, but also provide for a carbon reduced future. The only further point I wanted to take is that one of the examples we'll be talking about in the new series is the work being done on Haida Gwaii, because that's an area where I think we're seeing the future, because we're talking about imagining or reimagining the future. And Haida Gwaii has developed an eco-based system to forestry that is consistently meeting the nature values, but it also provides jobs and it provides a whole range of values for the Indigenous groups that occupy that island. And it's a very good example worldwide of how we can create jobs, tourism, renewable forests, and carbon storage all in one location. So I'm excited about presenting that story later in our series. Back to you, Francis.
Thank you. Well, Thank you, Kathy, for trying. That's all I can say. And one of the things that I know that Kathy was most supportive of is trying to protect and preserve forests. And she is involved with the Wildwood Ecoforestry Institute, which is up in the Yellow Point area. And that is a forest well worth saving. There's some old growth. There is forest practices still in place that go way back to its founder, Merv Wilkinson. And it's well worth checking out online. And another thing that we've been working on, and I'd love to thank our viewers who have been supportive of the Habitat Acquisition Trust's appeal for funds to save 49 acres of this amazing forest in the Sanats area known as Mountain Road Forest. And it is a wildlife corridor. It is a very special place. There are bear, there's cougar, there's deer, and birds of every description. It's a really robust ecosystem. So I hope you'll check it out. Kathy, do we hear you?
Thank you so much for being patient and for helping me through the technology here. So yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to speak to the urgency then that we have to, with which we have to address biodiversity in our province. I mean, we have spent the last few decades avoiding the problem, and we've been busier cutting our old growth faster than ever, which is going to be a real problem because we have so little of it left. And old growth is responsible for then holding the majority of our biodiversity, for serving as a carbon sink, and for just holding so many of those natural services on which our very lives depend. We're down now to less than 2% of it on Vancouver Island. We do implore the government then to put a moratorium on old growth logging. I know there's jobs and revenue to be considered here, but it's going to run out at some point. We need to do it before we lose it all. So that's the lessons that we've learned from Wildwood is that we have a working model where we have been harvesting wildwood since 1945, and we still have an intact ecosystem. Obviously, your annual allowable cut has to come down, but there are other ways then of looking at the forest other than just as standing timber. So we need to look at other revenues such as recreation and accommodation and foraging and education. Those are the things that will help us preserve what is so necessary to keep. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. We really appreciate all your efforts, and thanks to everyone for your patience too. I now have the great pleasure of introducing Charlene George. Charlene is a member of the Vancouver Island Sauk Nation and a cultural guide and artist. The Sauk people gained international acclaim by being one of the first solar communities in Canada. And Charlene uses her Indigenous wisdom and knowledge to help build better relationships. Welcome, Charlene. I understand you are working with the Sierra Club of BC and was wondering if you could please share with us how your work is helping chart a more sustainable future forward and what we need to do to be good ancestors.
Thank you for the introduction. Many to all the ones that spoke before me. Yes, one of my hats that I wear is working with Sierra Club. My biggest hat that I wear is speaking for the future grandbabies. But in that I include not just the human babies. I have many relatives, and I want us to center the conversation differently. As an artist and with my Indigenous lens, I'm going to ask for us, and that's what you're going to see in front of you. So this was a piece of beautiful work. So this has a life. This isn't an inanimate object. This is life. And as my auntie said when we were making this, is that you can't cut off any parts of this. Just like when we go out to collect and we ask for a small piece to help us as helpers of a tree, the tree bark, a medicine, we ask to sever that life from its mother. So I want to engage with us to think about things in a different way. I want us to move from a triangle model, which is a hierarchical model, which is what the Western thinking part is, systems, ideology, and set of value is based on. It's based on a triangle. Who's at the top? Right now, all of our conversations still are talking about the human at the top. And what I would like to suggest is moving and working together by putting that triangle inside a circle and eventually potentially losing the triangle. As an artist, I try to represent things visually. So what you see in front of you is wild woman and wild man. And in order not to offend as many of you as possible, I'm allowing a voice to be outside of human. From an intercultural place, if we look at from a nation to another nation, we might have a better idea of how to approach, for instance, a tree. My standing older relative. Imagine, if you could for a moment, that a tree does not have to give up its life in order for us to have a house. That's how, when we're looking at this, what's in front of your eyes here, the houses were built by using a living plank. There was only the 4 corner posts that had to come down. If we look on what Wild Woman is looking at, and on this side, we see our soapbox houses, and you can probably see my hands in air quotes, and you see that there's much more space in between, and it's much more grady. It's an even grade as opposed to a more natural grade where things are not exactly the same. I also want to encourage you that what we had, we can still have. It's not lost. For me, time is not a linear construct. I'd like to ask us to step outside of the value system where we have bad and good. If we do that and we take that moment, we consider that we are going to enter into a different way of valuing. And that would be offering up a new way to see things. Even though Wild Woman, for instance, and there will be a link in the chat box later, and you can go and visit this yourself at your time, is that you're going to see a tanker up in the top left when you're looking, facing this. By the way, it's her top right side, just so you know a different perspective. Many people only looking from the outside to the in, as opposed to imagining taking that lens and looking from out of that lens, as opposed to seeing from our side. So beauty is in everything, because it all comes from our sacred Tamath. And there's not an easy translation from that concept. It's not necessarily a word. And I think that what I'm offering you is an opportunity to walk across the bridge. This is visual. There are pictures in here, there's videos, there is songs, there is sounds that you might hear, the voices, for instance, of Raven. Raven is figured quite often inside here. I also have offered you stories and teachings that you might then approach looking at something differently. If you consider that you need to enter a doorway differently, how you're going to need to look at that is different, and your value is different. Right now, we're all talking about an economy-based view, an economy-based evaluation of what is success. We need to change what that view or that lens or that sense of self-satisfaction is, or how we could work together. How many of you consider the voices that are not heard? Who says that wolf is not at the table? Who says bear is not at the table? Who says the little birds is not at the table? Who says that the Oregon grape in English is not at the table? They are at the table. They are there and they are telling you things, but we have no ears. Auknakun, we have no ears. We're not listening. So some have approached seeing, some have approached doing, but we still think that we are entitled to speak for all of them because we're human and we're still in that triangle model instead of making an invitation. I don't have all the answers for you, but I have some suggestions. If we were to step back and think how one drop of water, one part of the wind goes around this whole beautiful sacred earth, we all come from an Indigenous place on this sacred earth, the sacred water, the sacred sky. We have forgotten where we come from. Might I invite you to look, where do you come from? How come you needed to make a great change when you came this way? How did you enter into being a good visitor? Do you know how to be a good visitor? When you step outside the door of your soapbox house, you're in someone else's home. Do you know how to step through that doorway? I am very humbly thankful for my new relative, Miss COVID. People are mad and angry, and I am grateful. I am understanding that she has severe protocol and boundaries, and I'm okay with that. I understand protocol. I understand protocol to a very deep level. Miss COVID and her cousins have offered us a moment of pause. Sadly, some of the human part of the family have decided to allow their inner voices to become outer, both in voice and in action. That's an interesting part of the question, but we don't have a lot of time to discuss that today. So what I'm going to do is focus on how do we move forward. We need to borrow a different pair of glasses. We need to see in a different way. We need to, if we can't see for ourselves, we need to borrow until we can see in a different way for ourselves or find out what fits for us. Just like when I'm helping someone to be learning how to draw or how to tell a story visually or pictorially, and then how to bring that into the other languages. We have the language of science. We have the language of storytelling. We have the language of the little bird. We have the language of the frog. We have the language of the water, the beautiful stormy waves that happened last night, and how we had no power, no hydropower for the next little while. So don't think about it as not having power. It's an opportunity. What do you get to experience when it gets quiet? How many of you get to experience what that is when it is quiet? Hopefully the whole human family got to experience that at some point during this time of visit with Miss COVID. I'd like to offer up a thought. How do we move forward in this really tippy canoe? I'm an ocean person. I also am honored that I have a French and Celtic grandmas as well. So how do you bridge those gaps in yourself? How do you open the doorway to the beautiful gifts that are in your DNA? And how do you respectfully borrow? And if we understand that we are borrowing from the future, our decisions today, when we are deciding to buy an inexpensive shampoo or a locally made shampoo, that small decision could be a very big one, because that impact has a greater expense. It's not cheaper necessarily if we look at the value of economics, but if we also include in that conversation, and we are not being siloed to only look at the raw data, but we are being collaborative, and we are working, we're working with one heart and one mind. We do not forget there is more than one creation story. Many people like to look at what is presented in front of you, what you see and seeing through watcher's eyes, between the worlds. And I'm offering between the worlds so that you have an opportunity to know you can pause and you can make a change. How you walk through that new doorway and who do you walk through that new doorway with is very important. Many Haitsepka for being here today. And I really hope that these words fall on really good ears and that you embrace as much as you can and make efforts. And as long as you're making effort and you apologize for those things knowingly or unknowingly that you do, then we can move forward together. Many Haitsepka. The one that's behind me here is Changer. And you're going to find that in a lot of the teachings that I've offered to you, bridges, an opportunity to look in a different way. Changer came and changed us. Miss COVID must be the relative of changer, because a lot of things are changing.
They sure are. Thank you, Charlene. Many Heichka, absolutely beautifully well spoken. And people are already asking, where can they get your big poster of that beautiful artwork that you've created?
It's actually an online curriculum using a Prezi technology, which was really timely if you want to look at it, but I look at it as this is what needed to happen, because now this is available for all of those ones who want to learn, who are in their own home and resting in their own home. You could take the time and opportunity to go and explore, and you can hear and you can see, because my nieces and I and my community and the co-workers that we work together with, including Sierra Club, including the school district, and the children, the future grandparents, they wanted to ask questions.
I can't thank you enough. We look forward to hearing more of your beautiful wisdom and words. Thank you, Charlene.
So just one last part. You asked the question, and I'm afraid I didn't quite fully answer it for you. I want to leave you with one more thought. So because the different value system, the triangle value system, is really entrenched in how we are today, including in our communities, and we have much division. It is not a cohesive voice, a cohesive place. That working with the Sierra family, we are moving to make that triangle into a circle. And we're hoping that that model will be more widely shared with you, maybe in another time, and that these are some possible ways that we could step through that doorway differently. Thank
you. And I look forward to us having you back again. Thank you, Charlene. Thank you. So our last presentation is with Grace Sinats. Grace Sanats is a 15-year-old climate activist and passionate advocate for lowering the voting age in Canada. Instead of feeling powerless and without a voice, she turned her frustration and anger with government decisions around the Site C Dam and Kinder Morgan pipeline into action. Grace decided no longer to be silent, but be a voice for climate action, and joined Our Earth, Our Future group in 2018. And less than a year later, she helped mobilize a day of action with more than 20,000 people taking to the streets of Victoria, BC. She has since organized 4 more additional climate strikes. And although Grace shared her message with the general public through her climate organizing, she still felt that her MPs and MLAs were not listening. Soon Grace found the Vote 16 movement and finally found a way to be heard. This March, Grace will give her first TEDx talk, and it'll focus on her vision for a more just and equitable society where all voices are heard. Welcome, Grace. Congratulations on your ongoing achievements and your upcoming TEDx talk. We're delighted you will join us again this spring to present with a number of your youth associates. Can you please share a bit about what you feel youth want us to hear and how we can reimagine and chart the future together?
Thank you so much, Frances, for this opportunity. So as you mentioned, I will be giving a TED Talk in March, and that is basically focused on everything I have wanted to say to politicians over the past 3 years of my activism, everything that I have felt that I have not been heard on, because in a way, even though I ended up speaking in front of 20,000 people last year, somehow I still felt silent. Somehow I still felt that no matter what I said, no one was hearing it. And until I found the Vote 16 movement, and I got incredibly involved with them, I found out all of the reasons laid out why the voting age should be 16. And to be honest, myself, I was a little hesitant at the beginning, which I now find ridiculous because I really want to vote. And I remember, I think last week, my teacher told me, he looked at me and he said, I think that lowering the voting age is the absolute most important thing we can do for the climate. And of course, I totally agree. And I started to hear a lot of talk about lowering the voting age, but it never came from the perspective of young people. It was almost always from self-interested politicians, whether it was some parties saying we can't do that, it won't be good for us, or some parties saying, yes, let's do that, it will be good for us. It was never for the right reasons. We need to be doing this because not only will it benefit young people to be enfranchised, it'll benefit the climate, because those young people, those same 20,000 people who were mobilized on the streets are now going to be able to vote. And that is how we make change. And that is how we get through climate plans like Bob and John were talking about, and how we reverse policies like Mace was talking about, and how we can really make sure that we meet our climate targets through a just, equitable way that doesn't leave anyone out.
Wow, you said it, Grace. Thank you so much. I can't wait until you're back this spring to share more with us and with your other amazing youth friends. And you're all so passionate and articulate. I'm so impressed. I can't wait. Now, I just want everyone to know, because we're running tight on time, our Q&A will be included. Your questions will be answered afterwards, included with the video, so that we can make sure that everybody's comments were acknowledged. So please be sure to join us again at 11 a.m. on Wednesday, January 27th, and let your friends and family know about this webinar series too. Now, John, can you please share what viewers can expect and enjoy on January 27th? And before you launch into that, I just want to thank John, Bob, Mace, Kathy, Charlene, and Grace for being with us today, and for everyone watching. But stay tuned, listen to what John has to say. This is exciting.
2 weeks' time will be the first time we start to delve into depth on some of the ways we're reimagining a future which is taking us to carbon neutrality. And this is dealing with how cities are planned and how we manage our waste. So we have 3 or 4 wonderful guests. First is Kim Fowler, who is a city planner and has been working for some years in several communities in BC and Alberta, trying to develop a new form of city that will be carbon neutral. And she's identified a number of restrictions in the current regulatory process that limit and create barriers for innovative city design. And she'll be talking about how we can break down these barriers, how we can do it more quickly, so we can achieve carbon neutral cities in a fast way by the next 20 or 30 years. Secondly, we have 2 people who are talking about zero waste. Larry Gardner is the Senior Waste Administrator for the city of Nanaimo. Nanaimo is probably one of the few communities, at least in Canada, that has formally adopted a zero waste target and intends to divert 90% of all waste created in the city out of the landfills by recycling, reuse, and repurposing waste. And he's going to be talking about some of the financial models he's developed uniquely in Nanaimo, which encourages the private sector to take waste out of the landfills and to reuse and recycle it. And Elaine Klimke is the president of the Mount Work Association, which is a community group looking at the Mount Work area in Victoria, where we have our major landfill, the Heartland landfill. And she and her colleagues are finding ways in which we can avoid expanding this landfill, losing potentially 73 acres of forests and loss of biodiversity and species at risk by moving towards zero waste, and also looking at ways we can reduce our carbon footprint by creating energy from waste resources. So she's a powerful voice for change in the community. And then we'll be supported by Fiona Lamb, who is an artist, and we'll be looking at plastics, how we can take plastics out of the environment. And she's created poems and visual arts that encourage us all to reduce our plastic footprint. So when you're looking at ways in which you can do something for the environment, look in next week, because we're 2 weeks' time, because we're going to give you lots of examples of how you can reduce your waste, reduce plastics, and create an imaginable and renewable city. Look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks' time.
See you in 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.